Hey everyone, in honor of hitting 2,000 YouTube subscribers and finally getting monetized, I thought it would be interesting to do a slightly vloggier video where I share my own life as well as the major career decisions I've had to make. We're going to do an overview of my entire career as well as take some learnings from a bunch of the major decisions I've had to make. So my name is Matt Ting, and I grew up in a city called Mississauga, which is the 6th largest city in all of Canada, and is actually the largest suburb in US or Canada. And my childhood was very suburban. I was either playing video games or practicing piano or grinding on studies. I went to a public high school called the Woodlands, and it was a pretty intense and competitive place that really shaped my own career ambitions and the kind of values that I would have. Now, in high school, by far the biggest career decision, of course, is deciding where to go to university. This was the first real fork in my life, and it was an incredibly difficult decision because at that point, I didn't really know much about myself. I didn't really know clearly what different jobs were like or what those paths would look like. And my entire life, my parents had very meticulously groomed me to go into medicine. However, deep in my gut, I kind of had this sense that I wouldn't enjoy it. I kind of hated my biology classes. I didn't like the idea of dealing with blood or so many patients. And so I was kind of weighing this against going into business. And I remember very clearly, it was the last week that we could even accept our university choices. I was deciding between what's probably the most prestigious pre-med program in all of Canada, as well as where I ended up picking Western University and the Ivey Business School. And honestly, the biggest thing that helped me decide this was a case competition called DECA, where you do loosely thematic business case studies and you compete. And my friend and I were lucky enough to win the entire international case competition for our category, and that motivated me to think that, hey, maybe I'll actually be good at business, and it's something that I really enjoyed doing. So when I got to Western, I had a pretty vague understanding of what career options were available in business. And I remember in my first year, we had an introduction to business course that all business students have to take. And someone that sat next to me invited me to a club meeting. And that club ended up being the Western Investment Club, which is a huge finance society at the school and really introduced me to the idea of working in banking or working in investing. So I started going to meetings and I got really engrossed in sort of making stock pitches and learning about these careers. At that time, I started formulating this idea that I would want to do finance. And the main reasons are as follows. And the first, quite honestly, was money. I think at that age, it was very easy for me to conflate success with money or grades, something that's very empirical and an easy metric to look at. And I thought if I could make the most money out of school, that would ultimately be, quote unquote, the best career decision for myself. And I thought to myself that if I wanted to make less money and work less in the future, it's easier to go that way, which I found out was true. The second factor of why I picked finance is because I honestly found stock pitches to be super fun. I really liked the collegial discussion of trying to dissect a business, doing some analytics to make a decision about the investment. I just found that really engaging, and the atmosphere of the Western Investment Club and the different stock pitch competitions I did was just very exciting. Thirdly, I really looked up to the older, smart people that were part of this club and were going into finance. I just viewed them as really successful, intelligent, and charismatic people, and they had a lot of the same values that I thought I did as well. Relatedly, I found that the people who were ending up in the US, people going to New York and San Francisco, were all coming from finance and a couple from product management, but the vast majority were from finance. And I thought for my career, the best places to be would be these large international cities. And I was very focused on going to the United States. And fourthly, and honestly arguably most importantly, I would say that I noticed there was a lot of tangible ways to improve your chances for finance. And what I mean by that is that there's so many different finance clubs, there's such a steep skill curve in the kind of technical things you need to know that I knew I could sort of level up my abilities over time. Management consulting, for example, which I esteem to be quite a good career path, it's one that gives you tons of optionality. I view that recruiting process to be a little more tricky because it's very contingent on only the full-time recruiting process. There aren't as many summer internships, and I just felt that the expected value for me personally was to go into finance. In my freshman summer, despite me trying to find an internship, I didn't really get anything super tangibly finance related. I ended up working for free at a tech startup in which I worked 2 or 3 days per week. On weekends, I worked at my friend's mobile phone store, selling and repairing mobile phones. And then in my spare time, I took the Canadian Securities course. I think a takeaway here is that if you can't find good finance experience, you still have to stay busy. Just do a bunch of random mediocre stuff to make yourself look like a motivated person. Looking back, I honestly think the Canadian Securities course was a waste of time. No one really cared about the certification. There's other ways to show that you're interested in finance. And of course, there's much better courses out there. Now, my sophomore year is when I started to really crank it up a notch. I became an analyst on the Western Investment Club, and I started networking really aggressively to get a good finance internship that summer. I ended up landing an internship at a search fund called Oxo Management, and I view that to be a very positive experience. I also consider Oxo Management to be one of the best search funds in Canada, and being exposed to that kind of growth trajectory and the different kinds of projects was really engaging. But getting that job required a lot of cold emailing. I ended up talking to probably 1 or 2 people every single week in order to finally land that internship. So Western and Ivey follows a 2+2 program. So for my first 2 years, I was a general business student. And then in my 3rd and 4th year, I was actually a student at the Ivey Business School. And I was told by a lot of people that your first semester at Ivey matters a lot. Now, recruiting is a little bit different now, but back in my day, all of the internship recruiting happened after your first semester of junior year. Now it's in your sophomore year, so the things you care about and the factors are a little bit different. But for me, my main objective was getting really good grades. So I had a laser focus on getting good grades. I ended up being first in our entire class when we were going through recruiting, and that allowed me to get a lot of different looks and interviews from great places. So I was able to land an internship with Silver Lake Partners out in Menlo Park. And it was a good experience being surrounded by such capable investors. I think Silver Lake is probably the preeminent TMT-focused fund in the entire world, but I ended up deciding to recruit for investment banking for full time. With Silver Lake, I wasn't the best cultural fit, and I was also very interested in starting my career in New York. So I ended up recruiting and joining Evercore for investment banking in New York. Now, the rest of my senior year was honestly pretty chill. I didn't do that much career-focused stuff. Now let's talk about the work chapter of my life. So I started at Evercore in M&A in New York, and I dedicated to the technology team. But my main focus when I was there was honestly getting out. And I was extremely concentrated on recruiting for private equity. And I was lucky enough to get an offer with a great TMT-focused fund in New York called Providence Equity. And what I really liked about Providence was, one, they had an office in New York, and also the media assets that they had were extremely interesting. I found their portfolio companies to just be slightly more accessible and aligned with my interests. Now, with regards to investment banking, this was the period in which I found that I was pushed to my mental and emotional limits. And when I was in banking, I was working 75 plus hours every single week, and it really started taking a toll on just my overall well-being. One other important thing about investment banking is that I did really like the junior people at Evercore. Some of the people I met there, they've gone on to be my very close friends and people that I still keep in contact with. So I do think that there is a lot of cultural and network benefits that you get from doing banking. Now, with regards to private equity, I actually did really like the idea of investing. I liked working directly with management teams and learning about businesses, but I found that junior work is pretty difficult. You have all the menial tasks of investment banking, but modeling is way more difficult, and there's just a lot of stress in a culture like that. And when I was an associate, I was evaluating the mid-level and the senior people to understand the kind of commitment that they had to put into their own career. I still found that they were working a lot, and they gave up a lot of sacrifice to pursue such lucrative positions. It was around this time that I also decided against business school, which in my mind is probably the most important career decision I've had to make since college. And I was pretty enamored with going to a prestigious school like HBS or Stanford for a very long time. Now, Evercore and Providence are good brands within finance, but I still wanted that external stamp that really said that I had made it. But as I got closer and closer to making that decision, I decided against it. The short of it is that I wasn't prepared to spend that much money and take on debt in order to have what I viewed as relatively similar career options in the short term. Over time in private equity, I was also more and more interested in doing something entrepreneurial. So let's talk about my current career prospects and how I think about my career in the future. Now, the number one question that I get today is, am I doing Peak Frameworks full time? And I would say the answer is kind of yes. I'm going to follow the runway for Peak Frameworks for the next year to see how big it can get, because I've already been really impressed with the number of subscribers we've got on YouTube, as well as the number of sales we've had on the course. Honestly, as I reflect about it, I think that there is a need for high quality, transparent content in finance, and it's something that I really enjoy doing. However, I'm not naive. I know that the incumbents have a tremendous presence in this space, and I'm prepared to do other things if it doesn't work out. The first thing on my mind would be to start my own search fund. I was really impressed in my second year working with these people, how they were their own bosses, they had equity in this fast growing company, and they still got to do some operations. To me, that kind of sounds like the blend that I'm going for. I kind of like doing the nitty gritty operations, but I also like the finance aspect of trying to optimize returns and find a high quality investment. If that fails, or if I can't find a good company to purchase, I think the next thing would be to join a very small growth-oriented company. I would describe this experience as being the finance or strategy person in a fast-growing company. Again, this kind of experience would be a lot more entrepreneurial in nature, and when I just reflect upon my own career values, I think the idea of control and incentives are very important to me. And lastly, if all of those things fail, I think the first kind of job I would look for in finance would either be a long-only type mutual fund or a pension plan. So I'm thinking more stable capital where the hours are a little bit more tolerable and you're still getting to do that cool investing type of work. So my career honestly hasn't been too long yet, but here's some general advice that I would give to people sort of in college or struggling with one of the career junctions that I've been through. The first, I think, is to try to do mini experiments or small projects whenever you can when the stakes are low. So this would include things like extracurriculars, starting a blog, things that are kind of more exotic or different that you wouldn't normally do in your job. Because this is where you get to meet interesting people. This is where you can expose yourself to different kinds of paths. When I think about my own decisions, if it wasn't for DECA, I probably wouldn't have gone into business. And if it wasn't for WIC, I probably wouldn't have gone into finance. The second thing, and this is more to do with recruiting, but I think it's always prudent to research when your effort will have the highest ROI. Now, when I think about recruiting, honestly, it's very systematic. There's a couple of points that you really have to focus on and totally nail. When I spoke to older people when I was at Ivey, they all said to really focus on your first semester of school, and that's why I cared about it so much. When I spoke to people in private equity, they all said that recruiting kicks off earlier than you'll ever expect, so you have to be ready for that too. And I identified these times as the points when I really had to care about my work quality as well as my output. You know, careers are very long, it's a marathon, and if you're always at full capacity, it can be extremely tiring. So honestly, take a slightly lazier approach and just pick your battles and find out the battles that are going to help you the most in your career. The last thing I'd recommend, and it's more of a soft skill type recommendation, but you should try to surround yourself with people who have similar values to you. And by values, I mean career values in the way of monetary goals, lifestyle goals, and maybe even geographic goals. It was really difficult to sort of leave the path, not go to business school, and walk away from private equity. But when I talked to the people around me, I just kind of realized that I didn't have the aspirations to make as much money as people who were on the private equity partner path, and I didn't want to work as many hours as a lot of them. And what really helped me make that decision was knowing people who were ex-finance, who were entrepreneurs, knowing people in tech who had much better lifestyles. Just having that contrast and having a diversity of opinion, I think can be really helpful in helping you come to your own decision. So that's kind of my life and career up until this point. I hope that was interesting to you, and now you know the person that's creating all of this finance content. If you're interested in learning more about Peak Frameworks, you can of course go to our new website at peakframeworks.com. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.